He was on his knees. A man who had served one of the most feared criminal organizations in Los Angeles for 12 years. A man built like a wall, hardened by decades of violence and loyalty, was on his knees on a marble floor in front of a black woman in a champagne dress. And she had not asked for it. Her name was Celeste Oh, and minutes before, this same man had blocked her path, crossed his arms, and looked her dead in the eyes in front of witnesses and said he would never bow to a black woman. He said it loud. He said it deliberately. He wanted the other guards to hear it. What he didn't know was that the most dangerous man in Koreatown had already heard every word. Jae-won Oh, the Korean Mafia boss who controlled import routes, private security contracts, and the silence of people who knew too much, walked into that corridor and didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't need to. He simply looked at the man who had humiliated his wife and said 4 words: "Bring a cushion." But here is where the story changes. Here is where Celeste did something that no one in that corridor expected. Something that not even Jae-won, a man who had spent his entire life reading people, saw coming. Because revenge would have been easy. Revenge would have been satisfying. What she chose instead was something far more powerful than revenge. And by the end of that night, every man at that table was standing when she walked into the room. Not because they were told to, because they understood, finally, exactly who she was. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. The corridor smelled of sandalwood and cold marble, the kind of scent that clings to places where serious men make serious decisions behind closed doors. It was a Thursday evening in Koreatown, Los Angeles, and the building that housed the Oh family's private operations floor stood exactly as it always did, still, deliberate, and completely indifferent to the lives it consumed. Celeste walked out of the private elevator the way she always did. Not with arrogance, not with performance, simply with the quiet certainty of a woman who had long ago decided that she would never shrink herself to fit inside a room. Her box braids, long, dark, threaded with thin gold filaments that caught the corridor light, swayed with each step. The champagne silk of her dress moved like water. The black Hermes bag hung from her arm with the casual ease of something that had always belonged there. Around her neck, barely visible at the hollow of her throat, a small gold dragon pendant rested against her skin. She had never taken it off, not once, in 3 years of marriage. She was going to the monthly dinner, the gathering of allied clan leaders that Jae-won insisted she attend. Not as decoration. He had been very clear about that, years ago, in a rare moment when he had spoken more words than necessary. "They need to see you next to me," he had said, his voice the same temperature it always was. Low, even, carrying the particular weight of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "Not because I need them to accept you, because I need them to understand what I would do for you." She had understood what he meant. She always did. Donghyun Park was standing at the access door to the private hall when she reached the end of the corridor. She had known him for 3 years. A large man, broad across the shoulders, with the flattened features of someone who had absorbed more than a few blows in his life and had decided to wear the evidence without apology. He had served the Oh family for 12 years before she had ever existed in their world. She had always sensed, without needing confirmation, that he considered her arrival an aberration, a disruption to an order he believed in, with the specific stubbornness of a man who had confused habit for principle. She approached without hesitation. Parksy. Her voice was even, unhurried. Is Jae-won already inside? Dong-hyun did not move. His arms, which had been at his sides, crossed slowly over his chest. His eyes, small, flat, carrying something that had been building for a long time, met hers with a directness that was not respect. This entrance is for clan members, he said. You don't have clearance to enter. The corridor around them was not empty. 2 other guards stood further down the wall, close enough to hear everything, far enough to pretend later that they hadn't. The silence that followed Dong-hyun's words was the specific kind that happens when everyone present understands that something irreversible has just been said. Celeste looked at him for a moment. She did not look away. She did not adjust her expression. Move, Park. He did not move. Instead, something shifted in his posture, a slight expansion, a calculation. And when he spoke again, his voice was louder, deliberately louder. I don't bow to a black woman, he said, especially not one who's only here because the boss stopped thinking clearly. What happened inside Celeste in that moment was not visible to anyone watching. It was not new. It was a pain with a specific texture, one she had learned to recognize early and had spent years learning to carry without letting it show. Because showing it would mean handing something of herself to someone who had not earned the right to hold it. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them, adjusted the strap of the birkin against her arm, and stayed exactly where she was. Because Celeste Oh had been married to Jae-won long enough to know one thing with absolute certainty. He never arrived at an important dinner alone. She heard him before she saw him, not his footsteps. Jae-won Oh did not make noise when he walked, a habit so deeply ingrained that she had stopped noticing it years ago and only registered its absence when other men moved through a room like they were announcing themselves. What she heard was the shift in the atmosphere, the way the 2 guards at the far wall suddenly found reasons to look at the floor, the way Dong-hyun's breathing changed, barely, almost imperceptibly, in the half-second before she turned her head. Jae-won came from the lateral corridor with 2 men she recognized as representatives of allied families. He was wearing graphite, as he almost always did for these dinners. The suit was Italian, cut precisely to the width of his shoulders. The collar of his black shirt opened just enough to show the beginning of the tattoos that traveled up his neck. The dragon, the cherry blossoms, the dense black ink that had been accumulating since he was 19 years old and had made his first irreversible decision. His hair was pulled back, with 1 strand loose at his temple. His Patek Philippe caught the corridor light for exactly a moment before he adjusted his angle and it disappeared again. He took in the scene in the time it takes most people to blink. Celeste, standing. Dong-hyun, blocking. The 2 guards examining the floor with sudden intensity. The specific quality of the silence that had settled over the corridor like sediment after something disturbs still water. He did not accelerate his pace. He did not change his expression. He walked to where Celeste was standing and stopped beside her, close enough that his arm was almost touching hers, and for a moment he simply looked at her. His eyes, black, still, the kind of eyes that had learned to contain everything they processed rather than broadcast it, held hers for 3 seconds. What passed between them in those 3 seconds required no words. She saw it, and he knew she saw it. I understand what happened. It is handled. Then he turned to Dong-hyun. The 2 allied representatives had gone very quiet. They were experienced men. They understood, with the particular intelligence of people who have survived inside violent hierarchies for decades, that what they were about to witness was not a disciplinary incident. It was a demonstration. And demonstrations inside the Oh family's walls were never accidental. "What did you say to my wife, Park?" Jae-won's voice was in Korean, low, completely level. Dong-hyun held his posture. 12 years of service was a long time, long enough to have watched Jae-won climb from a mid-level enforcer to the man who controlled the western corridor of the family's entire American operation, long enough to have seen what happened to the men who underestimated him. And yet something in Dong-hyun, the specific stubbornness of a man who has convinced himself that his prejudice is a form of loyalty, held him upright. "Boss." His voice was careful. "I'm protecting the family's standing. A woman from outside shouldn't have unrestricted access to a gathering of this level. You blocked the passage of Mrs. Oh." Taewon did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the thing that men who didn't know him failed to understand. The volume was irrelevant. The temperature was everything. And right now, the temperature was the specific cold of something that has dropped past the point where it can be recovered. "You humiliated my wife in front of witnesses. And your position is that you were protecting my honor?" Dong-hyun opened his mouth. "You were not protecting anything," Jae-won said, before the first word could form. "You were challenging me." "You used her to do it. Because you calculated, somewhere in the 12 years you have spent inside this family, that she was the one place I could be reached." The corridor was absolutely silent now. Jae-won turned slightly toward the two guards at the far wall. His voice did not change. "Bring a cushion." One of the guards moved immediately. The other kept his eyes forward. "Park is going to kneel," Jae-won said. "Here, in front of Mrs. Oh. And he is going to apologize until she decides whether or not to accept it." Dong-hyun's face changed. The stubbornness cracked first. Then something underneath it. Something that might have been the beginning of genuine fear, or might have been the specific humiliation of a man who has just understood, too late, the precise size of his miscalculation. He looked at Taewon. He looked at Celeste. He looked at the two allied representatives standing 3 meters away, who were watching with the careful, neutral expressions of men who knew they were seeing something they would be discussing for years. The cushion arrived. Dong-hyun Park, 42 years old, 115 kilograms, 12 years of service to the most dangerous family in Koreatown, lowered himself to his knees on the corridor floor in front of Celeste Oh. She looked at him. Her face gave nothing away. Beside her, she felt Taewon's hand settle at the small of her back. Light, almost imperceptible. The specific weight of a man who was not restraining someone, but simply saying, "I am here. Whatever you decide, I am here." Celeste looked at Dong-hyun for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure. Long enough that both allied representatives had shifted their weight almost without realizing it. And then she did something that no one in that corridor, not the guards, not the representatives, not Dong-hyun, not even Jae-won, had anticipated. She crouched down, not theatrically, not slowly for effect. She simply lowered herself until her eyes were level with Dong-hyun's. And when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that only he could hear it. "Get up, Park." The words were not loud. They were not sharp. They carried the specific weight of something that has been decided before it is spoken. The voice of a woman who had long ago learned the difference between power that needs to announce itself and power that simply exists. Dong-hyun did not move immediately. His eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, rose slowly until they met hers. Up close, she could see things that distance had hidden. The deep crease between his brows that had been there so long it had stopped being an expression and become a feature. The way his jaw was working slightly, as if he was processing something his body had not yet communicated to the rest of him. The particular blankness of a man who has spent so long being certain about something that the moment of being wrong has no framework to land inside. "You didn't kneel because he told you to," Celeste said. Her voice was still quiet, still even. "You kneel because somewhere underneath everything you've told yourself about why you did what you did, underneath the loyalty and the tradition, and whatever word you've been using for it, you already know that you were wrong. You've known it since the moment the words left your mouth." She paused, let it settle. "I don't need your knees. I don't need your apology. What I need from you, I will never get, because it would require you to understand something about me that you have already decided you don't want to understand." She held his gaze for one more moment. "So get up and think carefully for the rest of your life about the difference between a man who serves his boss and a man who respects him." She straightened, adjusted the gold dragon pendant at her throat with one finger, the gesture so small and habitual that it looked like breathing. Then she turned, looking at Jae-won with an expression that was entirely private, something that belonged only to the two of them, and the 3 years of a marriage that the rest of the world had opinions about, and said, with complete simplicity, "I'm hungry. Let's go in." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which Dong-hyun remained on his knees on the corridor floor, and the two allied representatives stood very still, and the guards at the wall continued their intense study of the middle distance. And Jae-won Oh stood, without moving, looking at his wife's back as she turned toward the entrance of the private hall. In 12 years of running an operation that required him to read people with the precision of a man whose life depended on getting it right, Jae-won had developed an almost involuntary catalog of the moments that revealed what someone actually was. Not what they presented, not what they wanted to be seen as, what they actually were in the specific, unguarded seconds when the situation exceeded whatever performance they had prepared. He had one of those moments now, watching Celeste walk toward the door, the Birkin steady on her arm, the champagne silk moving, the gold threads in her braids catching the corridor light, and understanding, with a clarity that had nothing performative about it, that she had just done something he could not have done, not because he lacked the capability, but because his instinct, forged in a world where mercy was read as weakness, and weakness invited predation, would never have allowed it. She had looked at the man who had humiliated her, and instead of taking what the situation had handed her, the complete, witnessed, irreversible destruction of his standing, she had offered him a way to understand what he had done. She had given him a mirror instead of a wound. Jae-won looked at Dong-hyun, still on his knees. The older man's face had gone through several expressions in the last 30 seconds and had arrived at something that was difficult to name. Not quite shame, not quite relief, somewhere in the territory between a man who has been punished and a man who has been seen, and is not sure which of those things is harder to carry. Jae-won crouched down to Dong-hyun's level, the way Celeste had done, and when he spoke, it was in Korean, quiet enough that it carried only as far as it needed to. "You should be thanking her," he said, "not me. She is the reason you still have the use of your legs tonight." He let that land for exactly a moment. "You served this family for 12 years. In 12 years, you learned how I handle a direct challenge to my authority.
What you failed to learn is what I consider worth protecting above the authority itself." He stood, straightened his jacket, looked at the two allied representatives
Who had the careful expressions of men filing everything away for later, and nodded once, the specific nod that meant, "We will not discuss this further tonight, but we have all understood what we needed to understand." Then he walked through the door that Celeste had already passed through, his hand touching her back lightly as he came up beside her, and the private hall received them both the way it always had, with its low lighting and its long table, and its assembly of men who controlled significant portions of what moved illegally through the western seaboard. Except that tonight, for the first time, every man at that table was on his feet when Celeste walked in. Not because Jae-won had told them to stand, he hadn't. Not because protocol required it, it didn't. But because they had all, in one way or another, received the information about what had happened in the corridor in the 30 seconds between Celeste entering and Jae-won following her. The speed at which information travels inside closed hierarchies is one of its most reliable features. And because powerful men, whatever else they are extraordinarily good at recognizing power when it has just demonstrated itself without raising its voice. Celeste took her seat at Jae-won's right hand, placed the Birkin on the empty chair beside her, looked around the table with the calm, unhurried gaze of a woman who had always known exactly where she belonged, even when no one else in the room had figured it out yet. The dinner began. The dinner lasted 3 hours. In those 3 hours, 7 men who controlled everything from import routes through the port of Long Beach to the private security contracts of half the Korean-owned commercial blocks in Los Angeles talked about money, territory, and the specific logistical problems that arise when two allied families disagree about the percentage split on a shared operation. They talked about a federal investigation that had gotten closer than anyone was comfortable with. They talked about a lieutenant in the San Diego branch who had been making decisions above his authority for the past 2 months and would need to be reminded, in whatever way proved most efficient, of where his authority ended. Celeste sat through all of it. She always did. She did not interrupt. She did not perform engagement, did not lean forward at the dramatic moments or adjust her expression to signal that she was following along. She simply listened, with the complete, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the most valuable thing you can do inside a room full of powerful men is make them forget, gradually, that you are listening at all. She had learned this early. Not from Jae-won, who had never tried to teach her anything about his world, operating on the apparent conviction that she would either understand it or she wouldn't, and that either outcome would reveal something true. She had learned it from watching, from 3 years of sitting at tables like this one, in rooms like this one, and understanding that the men who underestimated her were, without exception, handing her something. By the end of the first hour, 2 of the 7 men had addressed remarks directly to her, not performatively, not the specific politeness of men who are demonstrating that they are the kind of men who are polite to women. Genuine, operational remarks, the kind you make to someone you have decided, in the recalibrating way that powerful people recalibrate, is worth including in the actual conversation. She answered both of them with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. She did not over-explain. She did not qualify. She said what she thought and let it stand there, the way Jae-won did, and watched both men register the register. The specific moment when someone recategorizes you from background to foreground in the architecture of a room. Jae-won noticed. He noticed everything, but he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and because the particular pride he felt was not the kind that requires expression. It was the quiet, settled kind. The kind that comes not from watching someone perform well, but from watching someone simply be what they are, without adjustment, in a context that had been designed to make adjustment feel necessary. The dinner ended at 10:47. The Allied representatives left in the specific order that hierarchy dictated, with the handshakes and the careful non-commitments that close these kinds of evenings. The room emptied gradually, the way formal rooms do, with the slight decompression of men returning to versions of themselves that don't require the same degree of maintenance. When the last guest had gone, Jae-won and Celeste were left alone in the private hall. The long table still held the remnants of the meal, glasses, the folded linen, the particular debris of a conversation that had lasted 3 hours. Celeste reached up and pulled the gold thread from one of her braids, a small, idle gesture, and held it between her fingers for a moment, looking at the table. "They stood up when you walked in," Jae-won said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the door the last guest had used, as if he was still processing the architecture of the evening. "I noticed," Celeste said. "That has never happened before." He paused. "In 4 years of these dinners, it has never happened before." Celeste set the gold thread on the table in front of her. "It happened because of what you did in the corridor," she said. "You showed them what I was worth to you. That's what they responded to." Jae-won was quiet for a moment. Then, "No." She looked at him. "They stood because of what you did after," he said. "What I did in the corridor? Any of them would have done the same. A man protecting his wife is not remarkable to men like these. They have all done it in one form or another." He turned from the door and looked at her directly, with the full, unguarded attention that he gave almost nothing and almost no one. "What you did, what you said to him, on his knees, with everyone watching, that is what they were standing for. They recognized it." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Los Angeles made its low, continuous noise. The city that never fully quieted, that ran its operations through the night with the same indifference to the hour that Jae-won's world ran its own. "He put in a transfer request," Jae-won said. "Donghyun, 2 hours ago, from his phone. Seoul branch." "I know you'll approve it," Celeste said. "Already did." She nodded slowly. There was no satisfaction in her face. No relief, exactly. Something more considered than either of those things. The expression of a woman who had wanted justice and received it, and was now sitting quietly with the weight of what justice actually costs, which is never nothing, even when it is deserved. Jae-won crossed the room and stood beside her, not in front of her, beside her, the way he always positioned himself, adjacent, not obstructing, present without occupying the space she needed to occupy. He reached out and touched the gold dragon pendant at her throat very lightly with one finger, the same way she touched it herself when she was thinking. "You know what they'll remember," he said, "when they think about tonight. In a year, in 10 years, when they're sitting in rooms like this one, with men who weren't here." "What?" she said. "That the most dangerous thing in the room tonight," Jae-won said, "was the woman who didn't need to be." Celeste looked at him. Then, slowly, she smiled. The full version, the one she did not produce for rooms or occasions or the performance of any feeling she didn't actually have, the one that appeared only when something reached her before she could decide whether to let it. It changed her face entirely, the way it always did, and Jae-won watched it the way he always watched it, with the particular attention of a man who has built an entire empire, and found that the thing he guards most carefully fits around a woman's throat on a gold chain, and weighs almost nothing at all. They left the hall together, side by side, the Birkin on her arm, his hand at her back, moving through the corridor where a cushion had been removed, and a 12-year certainty had collapsed out into the Los Angeles night that received them both without ceremony, the way cities receive everything, with complete indifference to the size of what just happened inside their walls. But the men who had been in that room would remember. They always do, when they have witnessed the specific, rare thing. Not power taken, not power given, but power that was simply, quietly, undeniably there, waiting for the room to catch up. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of someone who had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who confused their own prejudice for principle and had to choose between taking what the moment offered you or responding with something harder, something quieter, something that cost more than anger ever would? Celeste didn't need that man's apology. She needed him to understand. And that distinction between demanding submission and offering truth is what separated her from everyone else in that corridor. Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, love, and the kind of strength that never raises its voice, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.